What if I told you that some of Hollywood's most beloved child stars were fighting battles so dark that studios spent decades burying the truth? After researching these stories, I discovered a pattern of systematic destruction that'll change how you watch those classic films forever. Hollywood's golden age wasn't golden, it was blood money. These child stars didn't just lose their fortunes, they lost everything, and it wasn't an accident. Our last story reveals the systematic pattern that destroyed them all. You're not ready for this truth. Comment if you recognize these names, because their suffering entertained millions. Let's start with the boy Disney erased from history. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's golden boy turned forgotten ghost. Bobby Driscoll had everything going for him. At 12, he won an Academy Award, presented by Donald O'Connor himself in 1950. Walt Disney called him his living treasure, and honestly, that's exactly what Bobby was. This kid could act, really act, not just mug for the camera like so many child performers. Let me paint you the picture of Bobby's early success. He wasn't just another pretty face that caught a talent scout's eye. Bobby had that rare combination of natural charisma and genuine acting ability that comes along maybe once in a generation. When he was cast in Song of the South at age 9, veteran actors on set were amazed by his professionalism. He'd memorize not just his own lines, but everyone else's too. Directors would find him helping other child actors with their scenes between takes. The money was flowing like water. By 1950, Bobby was earning $1,750 per week. That's over $500,000 annually in today's money. His parents bought a beautiful home in Hollywood Hills, complete with a swimming pool and tennis court. Bobby had his own tutors, his own chauffeur, his own entourage. He was living like royalty. And why shouldn't he? He was Disney's golden boy, the studio's biggest child star since Shirley Temple. When Bobby voiced Peter Pan, Disney executives thought they'd found their male Shirley Temple. Here was a boy who could carry major films, who brought genuine heart to every role. The recording sessions for Peter Pan were magical, literally. Bobby would act out the scenes while recording, flying around the sound booth, bringing that eternal boy to life with every breath. Then puberty hit like a freight train, and Disney's fairy tale turned into a nightmare. Bobby's voice started changing during Peter Pan recording sessions. Not gradually, overnight, it seemed. One day, he was hitting those clear, sweet high notes that made Peter Pan soar. The next, his voice was cracking like broken glass. The Disney executives were horrified. They tried everything, different microphone techniques, vocal coaching, even suggesting hormonal treatments to delay his natural development. But it wasn't just his voice. Bobby's face was breaking out in severe acne that no amount of makeup could hide. The studio's solution? They tried experimental treatments that left his skin even worse. Worse still, he was growing, shooting up 3 inches in 6 months. The boy who'd been perfectly sized for child roles was becoming a gangly teenager overnight. Disney couldn't handle that reality. The boy who'd voiced the character who never grew up was committing Hollywood's ultimate sin, aging. Studio executives who'd once treated him like a beloved nephew now avoided him in the hallways. They'd whisper when he passed, discussing the Bobby Driscoll problem like he was a disease that needed curing. Disney terminated his contract with surgical precision. No farewell party, no thank you for the millions you've made us, no gold watch or commemorative plaque. Just a pink slip delivered by a studio lawyer and a security escort off the lot. Can you imagine? 12 years old and getting fired for the crime of growing up. The same executives who'd called him their living treasure now treated him like toxic waste. Bobby's parents, who'd grown accustomed to that lavish lifestyle his earnings provided, suddenly faced a crushing reality. Their son, who'd been earning more than most executives, couldn't book a commercial, let alone a movie. The phone that used to ring constantly with offers fell silent. The invitations to premieres and parties stopped coming. Hollywood had erased Bobby Driscoll as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. The rejection devastated Bobby in ways that still break my heart to think about. He tried returning to regular school, but the experience was brutal. Kids mercilessly bullied him, taunting him with Peter Pan's crow, calling him a has-been at 13. Teachers either ignored him or treated him like a curiosity. He felt like a freak show everywhere he went. The family moved to New York, hoping for a fresh start. Bobby tried Broadway, but casting directors saw him as that Disney kid, too damaged goods for legitimate theater. He dropped out of school, fell in with a rough crowd in Greenwich Village, and discovered that certain substances could numb the pain of being discarded by the only family he'd really known, Hollywood. By the mid-1960s, Bobby was spiraling downward at terrifying speed. The boy, who'd never touched alcohol, was now drinking heavily. The child who'd been protected from every vice was experimenting with increasingly dangerous substances. His few friends from the Disney days tried to help, but Bobby was too proud and too ashamed to accept charity from people who'd known him at his peak. He'd sleep in doorways, in abandoned buildings, anywhere he could find shelter. Sometimes people would recognize the voice, that distinctive Peter Pan voice, now roughened by substances and despair, and they'd do double takes, wondering if they were really looking at Disney's former golden boy. By 1968, Bobby was unrecognizable, living in an abandoned tenement in Greenwich Village. He was sharing needles with other forgotten souls, existing day to day on whatever he could beg, borrow, or steal. On March 30th, 2 boys playing in the building found his body. He'd been gone for days, maybe weeks. The medical examiner determined heart failure due to advanced hardening of arteries, often associated with prior substance use. He was 31 years old. Here's the part that'll break your heart. His body went unclaimed for over a year, buried in a pauper's grave on Hart Island, along with other unidentified souls. His own mother didn't know he'd passed away until a year and a half later, when she hired a private investigator to find her missing son. The investigator's first question was whether she wanted to sit down for the news. The boy, who'd brought magic to millions of children, who'd been Walt Disney's living treasure, who'd earned more money by age 12 than most people see in a lifetime, left this world believing he was worthless. He was buried under a number, not a name. No headstone, no memorial, no acknowledgement of the joy he'd brought to the world. Disney, the company that had profited millions from his voice and face, never sent flowers to his funeral. They never issued a statement. They acted like Bobby Driscoll had never existed. It wasn't until decades later, when film historians started asking uncomfortable questions, that Disney finally acknowledged their former star's tragic fate. But Bobby's story was just the beginning. His destruction was the template Hollywood would use on countless other young stars. Wait until you hear about our next star's horrific final moments. Judy Garland, the studio system's most famous casualty. Every time you watch The Wizard of Oz, you're watching a crime in progress. That innocent girl singing about bluebirds and rainbows? She was being systematically destroyed by the very studio that made her a star. MGM's treatment of Judy Garland wasn't just abuse. It was torture disguised as stardom, conducted with the precision of a medical experiment and the cruelty of a concentration camp. It started when she was 13 years old and still called Frances Gum. Louis B. Mayer, the notorious head of MGM, took one look at this talented teenager from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and decided she was too fat. Never mind that she was a normal, healthy teenager with an extraordinary voice. Never mind that she could sing with the emotional depth of someone twice her age. In Mayer's eyes, she was damaged goods that needed fixing. The studio put her on a regimen that would be considered criminal today: black coffee, chicken soup, and 80 cigarettes daily to suppress her appetite. They told her the cigarettes would keep her thin, that she needed to stay small and childlike for the cameras. At 13, Judy was chain-smoking 4 packs a day on studio orders, her young lungs filling with tar, while her stomach cramped from hunger. When the starvation diet wasn't enough, they introduced her to pep pills, amphetamines that kept her thin and energetic for those brutal 18-hour shooting days. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The pills kept her awake for days at a time, so they gave her barbiturates to sleep. The barbiturates made her groggy and unable to perform, so they gave her more amphetamines to wake up. By the time she was Dorothy, clicking her ruby slippers and singing about rainbows, Judy was caught in a pharmaceutical prison that would last her entire life. The abuse wasn't just chemical, it was psychological warfare designed to break her spirit. MGM executives called her "fat little pig" to her face during meetings. They had men follow her around the lot to make sure she wasn't sneaking food. Studio spies would report back if they saw her eating anything not on her approved list. They taped her breasts down for Wizard of Oz to make her look younger, while simultaneously sexualizing her in other roles, creating a sick contradiction that messed with her head. When she fell in love with actor Tyrone Power, the studio forced her to terminate a pregnancy to avoid scandal, then immediately pushed her into a marriage with composer David Rose as essentially a publicity arrangement. She was 16 years old, and grown men in suits were deciding whether she could be a mother, who she could love, who she had to marry. It was psychological torture disguised as career management. The torture showed on screen if you knew where to look. Those tears in Over the Rainbow? Real tears from a girl who was slowly being destroyed. The trembling hands in her later films? Withdrawal symptoms from the constant cycle of uppers and downers. The weight fluctuations that had gossip columnists clucking their tongues. A body at war with itself, pumped full of chemicals and starved of food and genuine love. MGM made millions off Judy's suffering. The Wizard of Oz alone generated over $100 million in its initial release. That's over $1 billion in today's money. Her films with Mickey Rooney were box office gold. The studio was literally printing money with her voice and pain. But Judy herself was being paid a fraction of what she generated, and most of that went to support the very system that was destroying her. By her 20s, Judy was a walking pharmaceutical experiment. She was taking 40 benzodrine pills a day. 40! Plus barbiturates to sleep, plus whatever else the studio doctors gave her to keep her functioning. She'd collapse on sets from exhaustion and substance withdrawal. She'd forget her lines, miss her marks, break down sobbing between takes. MGM's solution? More chemicals to keep her going. The studio had a doctor whose only job was to keep Judy supplied with whatever substances she needed to work. They called him a medical consultant, but he was really just a licensed dealer operating with MGM's blessing. When Judy tried to get clean on her own, they'd threatened to fire her, to sue her for breach of contract, to destroy her career completely. By her 30s, Judy had attempted to harm herself at least 20 times, slashing her wrists, taking overdoses, throwing herself in front of cars. Each incident was patched up by studio doctors who'd dry her out just enough to work, then start the cycle again. She was their cash cow, and they'd milk her until she was completely empty. Her personal life was a series of disasters, each one making the studio more money through publicity. 5 marriages, all of them disasters. Her husband seemed to share one profession, spending Judy's money, while she was making millions for MGM. Her personal finances were being looted by managers, husbands, and hangers-on, who saw her as a gold mine to be stripped clean. Her final years were a gothic horror story. She was performing in dingy clubs to pay tax bills that the studio's creative accounting had left her with. The woman who'd made MGM hundreds of millions was broke, performing for audiences who came to see if this would be the night. Judy Garland finally fell apart completely. She'd show up hours late, if at all, her voice a shadow of its former glory, her hands shaking, her eyes unfocused. But sometimes, just sometimes, she'd find that old magic and remind everyone why they'd fallen in love with Dorothy in the first place. Those moments made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. On June 22, 1969, her 5th husband, Mickey Deans, found her gone in their London bathroom. The coroner ruled it an accidental overdose of barbiturates, the very substances MGM had first given her 30 years earlier. The pills that were supposed to help her sleep had finally given her the only rest she'd known since childhood. But those who knew her wondered if it was really accidental. She'd been talking about going to sleep forever, about finally finding her rainbow somewhere beyond the pain. The woman who'd sung about a land where troubles melt like lemon drops had finally escaped to a place where there really were no troubles at all. MGM, the studio that had literally created and destroyed her, issued a brief statement expressing their condolences. They didn't mention that they'd been feeding her addictive substances since she was 10 years old. They didn't acknowledge their role in her destruction. They just moved on to the next young talent they could exploit. Think about this. Judy Garland's entire adult life was shaped by decisions made by studio executives when she was a child. They turned her into an addict, then acted surprised when addiction destroyed her. And they made hundreds of millions doing it. River Phoenix, the beautiful boy who burned too bright. River Phoenix was supposed to be different. When he emerged in the 1980s, he represented hope that Hollywood could nurture young artists without destroying them. Intelligent, environmentally conscious, seemingly grounded, despite his otherworldly beauty and gift for acting. But River's sensitivity, which made him such a compelling actor, also made him vulnerable to Hollywood's darker temptations. He felt everything deeply: the pain of his characters, the pressure of fame, the weight of being his family's primary breadwinner from his teenage years. Born into a family that joined the controversial religious group Children of God, River's childhood was unconventional. Long before Hollywood entered the picture, his parents eventually left the group, changing the family name from Bottom to Phoenix, symbolically rising from the ashes. River's breakthrough came with Stand By Me in 1986, where his portrayal revealed an actor of remarkable depth. Unlike many young performers who seemed to be playing dress-up, River inhabited his characters completely. Directors marveled at his instinctive understanding of human nature. As his star rose with films like Running on Empty and My Own Private Idaho, River struggled with the disconnect between his public image and private reality. Magazines portrayed him as the perfect teenage heartthrob, clean living, environmentally conscious, morally upright. But behind the scenes, River was experimenting with substances that promised to quiet the noise in his head, to ease the anxiety that came with constant scrutiny. His relationship with these substances was complicated by his genuine desire to expand his consciousness and creativity. River wasn't interested in numbing himself. He wanted to feel more, experience more, understand the human condition more deeply. But that line between exploration and dependency is thin, and River crossed it without realizing the danger. On October 30th, 1993, River attended the opening of Johnny Depp's new club, the Viper Room. That night, he took a combination of substances that his system couldn't handle. Outside the club, on the sidewalk of Sunset Boulevard, he collapsed while his younger brother Joaquin frantically called for help. The 911 call was heartbreaking. Joaquin's voice cracking as he begged paramedics to hurry, River convulsing on the ground. Toxicology found lethal levels of controlled substances. He was 23 years old, with at least 5 decades of brilliant performances ahead of him. Think about this. River Phoenix had everything: talent, beauty, intelligence, success. Yet none of it could protect him from an industry that turned sensitivity into vulnerability. Drop a comment if you think River could have been saved with today's support systems. Judith Barsi, The Land Before Time's Broken Voice. Judith Barsi had a voice that could make angels weep. As the voice of Ducky in The Land Before Time and Anne-Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven, she brought joy to millions of children who had no idea they were listening to a little girl living in absolute terror. At 10 years old, Judith possessed a rare combination of vocal talent and emotional intelligence that made her one of the most sought-after child voice actors in Hollywood. But behind the microphone was a child being systematically abused by the man who should have protected her most, her own father. Born to Hungarian immigrants, Maria and Josef Barsi, Judith started acting at age 5, when her natural charisma and photogenic appearance caught the attention of talent scouts. Her early success in commercials and small television roles seemed like the American dream realized, a hard-working immigrant family finding prosperity through their daughter's extraordinary talents. But success brought attention and money, and both would ultimately prove deadly. Judith was a natural performer from the beginning. Directors marveled at her ability to take direction, to understand complex emotional beats, to deliver performances that seemed impossible from someone so young. She could cry on cue, laugh with genuine joy, and convey heartbreak with just her voice. In an industry full of child actors who were coached and manufactured, Judith was the real deal, pure, natural talent. As her career took off, Judith became the family's primary breadwinner. By age 8, she was earning more money than most adults, supporting not just herself, but her parents and extended family members who'd moved to Los Angeles to be part of her success. The pressure on such a young child was enormous, but Judith handled it with grace and professionalism that impressed everyone who worked with her. But success changed her father Yosef in dark and terrible ways. Judith Barsi was a man consumed by jealousy, rage, and paranoia. As his daughter's career flourished and she became the family's primary source of income, his resentment grew into something much more sinister. He couldn't handle that his 10-year-old daughter was more successful than he'd ever been, that strangers recognized her on the street while he remained invisible. Yosef began physically and emotionally abusing both Judith and her mother Maria, creating a household ruled by fear and violence. The beautiful little girl who charmed audiences on screen lived in constant terror at home, never knowing when her father might explode into rage, never knowing if today would be the day he'd make good on his increasingly violent threats. The signs of abuse were visible to anyone who looked carefully, but the entertainment industry in the 1980s wasn't equipped, or perhaps wasn't motivated, to protect child performers from domestic violence. Judith would arrive at auditions and recording sessions with unexplained bruises that she'd explain away with practiced stories about clumsiness and accidents. She became increasingly anxious and withdrawn, a stark contrast to the bubbly, confident personality that had made her so appealing to casting directors. Her mother Maria was trapped in her own nightmare. An immigrant woman with limited English and even fewer resources, terrified of her husband but unable to protect her daughter or herself. Yosef had threatened to end both their lives if they ever tried to leave. And Maria believed him completely. She'd seen his capacity for violence firsthand, had felt his hands around her throat, had watched him destroy furniture in fits of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. Child welfare workers were called to investigate the Barsi home multiple times, responding to reports from concerned neighbors, teachers, and even some industry professionals who'd noticed changes in Judith's behavior. But Yosef was skilled at presenting a normal facade when outsiders were present. He'd transform from monster to concerned father in seconds, charming social workers with his accent and old-world manners, explaining away any concerns as cultural misunderstandings or typical immigrant struggles. The cycle of abuse continued and escalated while Judith's career reached new heights with major voice acting roles that should have been the foundation for a lifetime of success. She was booking prestigious projects, working with A-list actors, earning critical acclaim for her voice work. The Land Before Time was going to make her a household name, establish her as one of the premier child voice actors in Hollywood. The contrast between Judith's professional and personal life was heartbreaking beyond words. In recording studios, she was a consummate professional who could nail difficult dialogue in single takes. Directors marveled at her ability to convey complex emotions through voice alone. Fear, joy, sadness, hope, all delivered with the authenticity that made her characters come alive. But between takes, she'd sometimes break down crying for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't explain to the adults around her. Industry professionals who worked with Judith later said they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how to help. The entertainment business wasn't equipped to deal with domestic violence, especially in immigrant families, where cultural barriers made intervention even more difficult. Everyone assumed someone else was handling it, that surely the authorities were involved, that surely this talented little girl was being protected. As Judith's success grew, so did Yosef's paranoia and violence. He became convinced that Hollywood executives were trying to steal his daughter from him, that his wife was plotting to leave him, that everyone was conspiring against him. He'd rant about people trying to control his family, about immigrants being exploited by the American entertainment industry, about outsiders who didn't understand Hungarian traditions. The truth was simpler and more tragic. His own behavior was destroying the family he claimed to love and protect. His violence was driving away the very people he was trying to control. His paranoia was isolating them from anyone who might have helped. His rage was slowly murdering the joy that had made Judith special in the first place. Friends and neighbors later reported that Yosef's threats had become increasingly specific and terrifying in the weeks before the tragedy. He'd talk about ending everyone's suffering, about making sure no one could take his family away from him, about solving all their problems permanently. But in a culture that often dismissed domestic violence as a private family matter, these warnings went unheeded. On July 25, 1988, Yosef's threats finally became reality. In their San Fernando Valley home, he shot both Judith and Maria before setting the house on fire and taking his own life. Judith was found in her bedroom, still clutching a Jetsons videotape, one of the shows she'd worked on just weeks earlier. She was 10 years old, at the height of her career, with The Land Before Time, scheduled for release just months later. The crime scene was devastating. Investigators found evidence of the terror that had consumed that household. Holes punched in walls, broken furniture, children's drawings that showed stick figures being hurt by larger figures. Judith had been living in a war zone, trying to maintain her professional obligations while surviving daily threats to her life. The woman who gave voice to Ducky's eternal optimism was silenced forever by the very person who should have cherished that voice most. The little girl who brought hope and joy to millions of children around the world had her own hope and joy extinguished by the monster she called Daddy. Hollywood's response was typically inadequate. The industry expressed shock and sadness, but there was no serious examination of the systems that had failed to protect Judith. The Land Before Time was released on schedule, with Judith's voice bringing Ducky to life on screen, while audiences remained unaware that the little girl who'd created that magic was gone. The tragedy became a footnote in entertainment history rather than a catalyst for change. There were no new protections implemented for child actors, no mandatory training for industry professionals about recognizing signs of abuse, no systems put in place to ensure that what happened to Judith could never happen again. Think about this. Judith Barsi was generating income for agents, managers, studios, and dozens of other industry professionals. All these adults were making money from her talent, but none of them could protect a 10-year-old girl from being harmed in her own home. What does that say about our priorities? What does that say about the value we place on children's lives versus children's earning potential? Gary Coleman, different strokes, biggest tragedy. Gary Coleman should have been living proof that the entertainment industry had learned from its past mistakes. Born in 1968, decades after earlier child star tragedies, Gary had the benefit of stronger legal protections and greater awareness of the dangers facing young performers. But his story became perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Proof that fame can destroy children in new and devastating ways that no law can prevent. Let me tell you about Gary's early life, because it's crucial to understanding what came after. Gary's path to stardom began with a medical condition that would define his entire existence. Born with a congenital kidney disease called nephritis, he underwent multiple surgeries and treatments that stunted his growth and required lifelong medical management. The same condition that made his life difficult also made him perfect for television. At age 10, Gary looked like he was 6, with the face of an angel and the comedic timing of a seasoned professional. When casting directors saw him, they knew they'd found something special. A child who could deliver adult humor with childlike innocence. It was a combination that would make him millions and destroy his life. Different strokes made Gary one of the most recognizable faces in America. "What you talking about, Willis?" became part of the cultural lexicon, quoted everywhere from playgrounds to boardrooms. He was earning $100,000 per episode at the show's height, making him one of the highest-paid child actors in television history. That's nearly $400,000 per episode in today's money. For 8 seasons, Gary was America's sweetheart, the tiny boy with the big personality who could deliver punchlines like a veteran comedian. Fans adored him. Critics praised his natural timing. The show was a massive hit, and Gary was its breakout star. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. But the money that should have secured Gary's future was disappearing as fast as he earned it. His parents, Sue and Willie Coleman, had hired business managers who made investments that consistently lost money. Gary's adoption papers, he was adopted as an infant, gave his parents complete control over his earnings, and they used that control to make increasingly risky financial decisions. Medical expenses from his ongoing kidney problems consumed enormous amounts of his earnings. The treatments were experimental and expensive, often requiring trips to specialists around the country. While other child stars dealt with typical growing pains, Gary was fighting for his life, undergoing dialysis and preparing for eventual kidney transplants. Legal fees from various disputes ate away at what remained of his fortune. Gary's parents were in constant battles, with the show's producers over working conditions, with business managers over investments, with medical professionals over treatment options. Every dispute meant more lawyers, more bills, more money flowing out of Gary's accounts. Here's where it gets really ugly. Gary later discovered that his parents and business manager had been stealing from him systematically, while he was working grueling hours on set, dealing with medical treatments, and carrying the financial burden of multiple families. The adults in his life were looting his earnings for their own benefit. When Different Strokes ended in 1986, Gary faced what would become his adult nightmare. At 18, he looked like a child, but was no longer cute enough for children's roles. His medical condition had left him just 4 feet 8 inches tall, making romantic leads impossible and limiting him to character parts that rarely materialized. The entertainment industry that had made him rich as a child had no use for him as an adult. The transition was brutal. Gary had been working since he was 8 years old, but he'd never learned how to function in the real world. He'd been surrounded by handlers, agents, and studio executives his entire childhood. Now suddenly, he was on his own, with no marketable skills beyond the Arnold Jackson character that had made him famous. Gary's attempts at comeback were increasingly desperate and degrading. He appeared on reality shows like The Surreal Life, where cameras followed him around, documenting his struggles for entertainment. He did celebrity boxing matches, getting beaten up by other has-been celebrities while audiences laughed. He took roles in low-budget films that exploited his Different Strokes fame rather than showcasing any actual talent. Each appearance reminded audiences of what he'd been rather than who he was trying to become. People would recognize him and immediately start quoting Arnold Jackson lines, expecting him to perform like a trained monkey. "Say the line, Gary." "Say what you talking about, Willis." He'd smile and comply, but friends said it was destroying him inside. The medical expenses never stopped accumulating. Gary's kidney disease required constant treatment, including regular dialysis sessions and eventually multiple transplant surgeries. The costs were astronomical, and his dwindling finances couldn't keep up. Despite earning millions as a child, he was forced to declare bankruptcy multiple times, in 1999 and again in 2007. His personal relationships were complicated by his fame and physical limitations. Gary's size and appearance made normal romantic relationships difficult. Women would either treat him like a child or exploit his celebrity status. His trust had been shattered by family members and business partners who'd exploited him, making it nearly impossible for him to form genuine connections. He married twice, first to Shannon Price, a woman nearly 20 years younger who seemed more interested in his fading fame than in him as a person. Their relationship was volatile, marked by public fights and police calls. When they divorced and remarried, it only added to the circus atmosphere that seemed to follow Gary everywhere. The cruelest irony of Gary's later life was that he remained famous enough to be constantly recognized, but not successful enough to capitalize on that recognition. People would approach him on the street, expecting him to be the cheerful child they remembered from television, not understanding that Arnold Jackson had been a character, not a person. Gary felt trapped in a role he'd outgrown decades earlier. His later years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior and legal troubles. Arrests for disorderly conduct, assault charges, and public disputes with former wives and business partners painted a picture of a man at war with the world and himself. Each incident made headlines, turning Gary's private struggles into public entertainment once again. The entertainment industry that had created Gary Coleman showed no interest in helping him transition to adult life. There were no programs for former child stars, no support systems, no acknowledgement that they'd taken a child's innocence and turned it into profit. Gary was on his own, fighting battles that would have broken people twice his size. The end came suddenly on May 28, 2010. Gary suffered a brain hemorrhage at his Utah home and passed away 2 days later at age 42. Even his passing became controversial, with disputes over his medical care and estate exposing the family dynamics that had shaped his troubled life. Here's what really breaks my heart about Gary's story. He passed away largely alone, estranged from family members who'd profited from his talent. The boy who'd brought joy to millions of children around the world left this world isolated and broke, his childhood earnings squandered by the very people who were supposed to protect him. In 1993, Gary had won a lawsuit against his parents and former manager, with a court awarding him $1.28 million after finding they'd wrongfully profited while he was a minor. But by then, it was too late. The damage to his finances, his health, and his spirit had already been done. Think about this. Gary Coleman brought joy to millions, made TV executives rich, and created a catchphrase that's still quoted today. But he left this world believing he was worthless, forgotten by an industry that had used him up and thrown him away. What does that say about how we treat our entertainers? What does it say about us? Corey Haim, the lost boy who never found his way home. Corey Haim was the epitome of 1980s teen stardom. Beautiful, talented, blessed with a smile that could light up any movie screen. As one half of the two Coreys, alongside Corey Feldman, he defined what it meant to be a young heartthrob for an entire generation. But behind that perfect smile was a young man being systematically destroyed by the very industry that made him famous. Born in Toronto, Corey started acting as a child in Canadian productions before making his American debut in Firstborn at age 12. His breakout role came with Lucas, where his portrayal of a lovesick teenager showed both his natural charisma and ability to find emotional truth in every scene. When The Lost Boys made him a full-fledged teen idol, it seemed like Corey Haim could do no wrong. But success in Hollywood, especially for young male actors, came with dangers that Corey was unprepared to face. In interviews years later, both Corey and Feldman would reveal the horrific truth about what happened to young actors in 1980s Hollywood. A systematic culture of exploitation perpetrated by powerful men who used their positions to harm vulnerable teenagers. Corey later identified the moment his life changed forever. During a film production when he was 14, he was assaulted by a man he'd trusted, someone who'd presented himself as a mentor and father figure. The trauma of that assault and his inability to process or report it began a downward spiral that would consume the rest of his life. Like many trauma victims, Corey turned to substances to numb the pain and confusion he couldn't otherwise handle. What started as experimentation quickly became dependency, as he discovered that certain medications could temporarily quiet the voices in his head that told him he was damaged, worthless. The signs of his distress were visible to anyone who cared to look. His weight fluctuated dramatically. His behavior became increasingly erratic on set. He had difficulty maintaining relationships with co-stars and crew members. But in an industry where eccentricity is often dismissed as artistic temperament, Corey's cries for help were largely ignored. By the 1990s, Corey was trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. He'd get clean for months at a time, appearing on talk shows to discuss his recovery and attempt comebacks with direct-to-video films. But the underlying trauma that had started his problems was never properly addressed, and each relapse took him further from the bright-eyed teenager who'd charmed millions. On March 10, 2010, Corey was found gone in his mother's apartment at age 38. The official cause was pneumonia, but those who knew his story understood that his passing was the inevitable result of decades of untreated trauma. His body had simply given up after years of abuse and neglect. Here's what really gets me angry about Corey's story. He tried to speak out about the abuse he'd suffered, but nobody listened. Nobody protected him, and that same system is still operating today. Anissa Jones, Family Affairs' tragic Buffy. Every Thursday night, millions of Americans tuned in to watch 6-year-old Anissa Jones charm them as Buffy on Family Affair. With her blonde pigtails, Mrs. Beasley doll, and gap-toothed smile, she was America's little sister. But behind that adorable facade was a child being slowly destroyed by the very adults who were supposed to protect her. Anissa's problems started before Hollywood. Her parents' marriage was a war zone, with young Anissa and her brother caught in the crossfire. When they divorced, her mother Mary saw Anissa's beauty as a meal ticket, dragging her to audition after audition. When Anissa landed Family Affair, Mary thought they'd hit the jackpot. But the show's grueling schedule meant Anissa spent more time on set than at home, 5 days a week, 10 hours daily. She was Buffy those 5 days. The other two, she was expected to be a normal kid. But how do you play with dolls when you've spent all week pretending to play with them for cameras? The show's producers treated her like a prop rather than a person. They refused to let her grow up on screen, keeping her in little girl dresses and pigtails even as she entered adolescence. When she developed early, they bound her chest. When she wanted to cut her hair, they threatened to sue. She was trapped in Buffy's body, while Anissa screamed to get out. Her co-star, Brian Keith, who played Uncle Bill, later admitted he saw the warning signs, but didn't know what to do. Anissa would have crying jags between takes. She'd beg to go home. She started refusing to say certain lines, especially the cutesy baby talk that made audiences coo. The producer's solution? Threaten her with replacement. There were thousands of little girls who'd love to be Buffy. They reminded her constantly. When Family Affair ended in 1971, 13-year-old Anissa thought she was finally free. But freedom for a child star often means free fall. She'd earned over $200,000, but her mother had spent most of it. Worse, Anissa discovered she was unemployable. Casting directors saw Buffy, not Anissa. She was too old for child roles, too young for teen roles, and too typecast for anything else. High school was torture. Kids either mocked her for being Buffy or ignored her completely. She started hanging with the stoner crowd, finding that certain substances made the pain of being a has-been at 14 bearable. Her mother, desperate to recapture the Family Affair years, pushed her to audition for increasingly degrading roles. When Anissa refused, their relationship exploded. At 16, Anissa petitioned the court for emancipation from her mother. The judge, looking at this broken child, granted it. But freedom at 16 with no skills, no education, and no support system isn't freedom. It's abandonment. Anissa moved in with friends who were happy to party with a former TV star and spend what little money she had left. On August 28, 1976, Anissa went to a party in Oceanside, California. Witnesses said she seemed happy, laughing and dancing. She took what she thought was one substance, but was actually a massive dose of multiple dangerous compounds. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. She passed away at 18, 6 years after Family Affair ended. But really, Buffy had been destroying Anissa for years. Drop a comment if you remember watching Family Affair. Did you ever wonder what happened to little Buffy? Now you know, and it's heartbreaking. Jonathan Brandis, seaQuest's Lost Boy. Jonathan Brandis had the kind of face that launched 1,000 teenage crushes, and the kind of talent that promised decades of great performances. As Lucas Wolinchak on seaQuest DSV, he wasn't just another teen heartthrob. He was a serious young actor who brought intelligence and depth to every role. But Jonathan's story became a tragedy about what happens when early success creates expectations that become impossible to meet. Born in Connecticut, Jonathan started acting as a child, appearing in commercials and small television roles. Unlike many child stars pushed into the business by ambitious parents, Jonathan genuinely loved performing. He studied his craft seriously, working with coaches and developing technical skills that set him apart from his peers. His breakthrough came with The Never-Ending Story 2, where his performance as Bastian showed his ability to carry a major film while maintaining the authenticity that made him so appealing. The success led directly to seaQuest DSV, the underwater adventure series that would make him a household name and teen idol. But success as a teenager in Hollywood can be a double-edged sword. While Jonathan's career was flourishing, he was struggling with the pressure of being a role model for millions of young fans. He felt responsible for maintaining a perfect public image while dealing with the normal confusion and insecurities of adolescence. When seaQuest ended in 1996, Jonathan faced the challenge that destroys many child stars, the transition to adult roles. At 20, he was too old for teen heartthrob parts that had made him famous but too young and inexperienced for serious adult roles. Casting directors saw him as Lucas Wolinchak, not as Jonathan Brandis, the actor. Jonathan's response was to work harder, to try to prove his versatility as an actor. He took on independent films, anything that would show his range and remind people of his talent. But the entertainment industry has a short memory, and audiences had already moved on to the next generation of young stars. Friends described Jonathan as increasingly isolated in his final years. He'd always been introspective, But that quality began to turn into something darker. He became hypercritical of his own work, obsessing over perceived failures and missed opportunities. The entertainment industry's emphasis on youth became particularly cruel for Jonathan. While female stars face ageism throughout their careers, male actors typically have more longevity. But Jonathan's particular brand of boyish charm had an expiration date, and he knew it. On November 12, 2003, Jonathan was found gone in his Los Angeles apartment. He had taken his own life at age 27, leaving behind no note but plenty of unanswered questions. Friends and family were shocked. They'd known he was struggling professionally, but hadn't realized the depth of his despair. The young man, who'd seemed to have everything, had been fighting a battle that no one fully understood. It makes you wonder how many other stars are struggling in silence right now. Brad Renfro, the client's final case. Brad Renfro possessed the kind of raw natural talent that casting directors dream of finding. Discovered at age 10 playing in his Tennessee hometown, Brad had never acted professionally when he was cast as the lead in The Client, opposite Susan Sarandon and Tommy Lee Jones. His performance was so authentic, so lived in, that it seemed impossible he was acting at all. But Brad's natural ability came from a dark place. He understood troubled characters because he was living a troubled life. Growing up in a broken home in Knoxville, Brad was raised primarily by his grandmother, while his mother struggled with her own demons. When talent scouts discovered him, they saw a boy with the perfect combination of vulnerability and toughness that Hollywood loves in its young male stars. What they didn't see was a child who'd already experienced more trauma than most adults. The Client made Brad an overnight sensation. But success at 10 years old is a different kind of burden than adult fame. Brad was suddenly the family's primary breadwinner, responsible for supporting not just himself, but multiple relatives who'd become dependent on his earnings. Unlike other child stars who were sheltered by protective parents, Brad was largely on his own in Hollywood. His grandmother was loving but unprepared for the entertainment industry's demands and dangers. His mother was battling her own issues and couldn't provide the guidance he needed. The roles that followed The Client showed Brad's range, but also revealed his attraction to darker material. In Tom and Huck, Apt Pupil, and Bully, he played characters dealing with violence, corruption, and moral ambiguity. Directors praised his ability to find truth in difficult scenes, not realizing they were watching a young man process his own trauma through his characters. But Brad's personal struggles were escalating alongside his professional success. He began experimenting with substances in his early teens, initially as a way to cope with the pressures of fame and family responsibility. What started as occasional use quickly became a pattern of self-medication that would define the rest of his short life. His arrests began in his late teens: impaired driving, substance possession, public intoxication. Each incident made headlines, turning Brad's private struggles into public entertainment. The tabloid coverage was particularly cruel, portraying him as just another spoiled child star rather than a young man battling serious issues with minimal support. The film roles began to dry up as Brad's reputation for unreliability spread through Hollywood. Directors who'd once fought to cast him became reluctant to take chances on someone whose personal problems might derail their productions. Brad tried to get clean multiple times, entering treatment facilities and making sincere efforts to turn his life around. But addiction is particularly cruel to young people whose brains are still developing, and Brad's early trauma made recovery even more challenging. On January 15, 2008, Brad was found gone in his Los Angeles apartment by friends who'd come to check on him. He was 25 years old, having passed away from an accidental overdose. The clinical description couldn't capture the tragedy of a life cut short by circumstances beyond a child's ability to control. What makes Brad's story even sadder? The Oscars that year didn't include him in their In Memoriam segment. Hollywood had forgotten him that quickly. The shocking connection. Hollywood's systematic destruction. All right, we've reached the end. It's time for that revelation I promised at the beginning. Remember how I said there was a shocking pattern connecting all these tragedies? Here it is, and it's going to change everything you think you know about Hollywood's so-called golden age. Every single one of these collapses was either caused, enabled, or covered up by the studio system itself. This wasn't random bad luck, individual weakness, or unfortunate coincidence. This was systematic destruction conducted with the precision of a military operation and the ruthlessness of organized crime. Let me break down the pattern for you, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Step 1. Identification and isolation. The studios would identify talented children, often from poor or desperate families. They'd offer contracts that seemed like golden tickets, but were actually ownership papers. Parents would sign over complete control of their children's lives, earnings, and futures. The kids were immediately isolated from normal childhood experiences, from peers their own age, from any reality outside the studio system. Step 2. Chemical control. The studios got their young stars hooked on substances, uppers to keep them working 18-hour days, downers to make them sleep when their bodies were too wired to rest naturally. These weren't recreational substances. They were prescribed by studio doctors as part of their medical care. Judy Garland was addicted to amphetamines and barbiturates by age 10. Wallace Reed was given morphine by Paramount doctors and kept supplied until it destroyed him. Step 3. Financial exploitation. While these children were generating millions for the studios, their own earnings were being stolen, mismanaged, or spent by parents and business managers who were all part of the system. Jackie Coogan earned millions and was left with nothing. Gary Coleman made hundreds of thousands per episode and ended up bankrupt. The kids were making everyone rich, except themselves. Step 4. Psychological destruction. The studios systematically broke down these children's self-worth, making them dependent on external validation and studio approval. They were told they were special one day, worthless the next. They were sexualized as children, then discarded as damaged goods when they tried to grow up. The psychological torture was deliberate and designed to maintain control. Step 5. Abandonment and cover-up. When these young stars couldn't perform anymore, whether due to age, addiction, illness, or breakdown, the studios discarded them like broken machinery. They spread rumors about unreliability, blacklisted them from working, and then acted shocked when their former stars self-destructed. When tragedies occurred, the studios either covered them up or spun them as cautionary tales about the dangers of fame, never acknowledging their own role in the destruction. Think about it. Bobby Driscoll was given the boot the moment he hit puberty. Judy Garland was fed pills by MGM doctors from age 10 until she passed away from an overdose of those same substances 30 years later. River Phoenix was pushed to be a role model while struggling with trauma from his childhood that no one in Hollywood wanted to acknowledge or address. But here's what really gets me fired up about this pattern. It's still happening today. Oh, they've gotten sneakier about it, added more legal protections, hired better PR firms to manage the scandals. But the fundamental attitude hasn't changed one bit. Children are still being exploited. Parents are still selling their kids' childhoods for a shot at fame and fortune. And when things go wrong, Hollywood still looks the other way. Look at what happened to Britney Spears, put to work as a child, controlled by conservatorship as an adult, medicated and managed until she had a very public breakdown. Look at what happened to Amanda Bynes, Macaulay Culkin, Lindsay Lohan. The same pattern, over and over again. Different decade, same system. The studios learned from these early tragedies. All right, they learned how to hide their exploitation better, how to avoid legal liability, how to manage the public relations disasters when their young stars inevitably crash and burn. They didn't learn how to protect children. They learned how to protect themselves. Want proof? Here's a question for you. Can you name a single studio executive who was ever held legally responsible for what happened to these kids? Can you name one parent who faced criminal charges for exploitation? Can you point to one major policy change that actually protected young performers rather than just protecting the industry from lawsuits? The Coogan Law was supposed to protect child actors' earnings, but it's riddled with loopholes. Parents can still petition courts to access their children's money. Business managers can still make investments that mysteriously disappear. And there's still no meaningful oversight of the working conditions, the psychological pressure, or the pharmaceutical management that destroyed so many young lives. Here's the most infuriating part. Hollywood has turned these tragedies into entertainment. They make movies about Judy Garland's suffering, documentaries about child star exploitation, television specials about the curse of early fame. They're literally profiting from the same destruction they caused, turning their victims' pain into content for our consumption. And we, the audience, are complicit in this cycle. We watch those movies, we buy those documentaries, we click on those articles about child stars gone wrong. We consume their suffering as entertainment while pretending to feel bad about it. We're fascinated by the tragedy, but not motivated to prevent it from happening again. Drop a comment if you think this systematic destruction is still happening today. The difference between then and now isn't that Hollywood got more ethical, it's that they got better lawyers, more sophisticated contracts, and smarter public relations teams. The children are still being sacrificed. We're just not supposed to notice. But now that you know the pattern, you'll see it everywhere. You'll see it in the young stars who seem to age in dog years, who have public breakdowns, who struggle with addiction and mental health issues. You'll see it in the parents who move their entire families to Los Angeles based on their child's talent. You'll see it in the business managers who get rich while their young clients go broke. If these stories broke your heart like they broke mine, you need to hear about the 10 child stars who fought back against the system and won. But before I can tell those incredible stories of survival and triumph, I need to know you're as passionate about protecting young performers as I am. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because these heroes' stories deserve to be told, and their victories need to inspire the changes we still need today.